Chapter 14. Friends in Need. It was an example to me, and I fancy it might be to many others, to see how immediately Miss Matty set about the retrenchment which she knew to be right under her altered circumstances. While she went down to speak to Martha and break the intelligence to her, I stole out with my letter to the Aga Jenkins and went to the signor's lodgings to obtain the exact address. I bound the signora to secrecy, and indeed her military manners had a degree of shortness and reserve in them which made her always say as little as possible, except when under the pressure of strong excitement. Moreover, which made my secret doubly sure, the signor was now so far recovered as to be looking forward to traveling and conjuring again in the space of a few days, when he, his wife, and little Phoebe would leave Cranford. Indeed, I found him looking over a great black and red placard in which the Signor Brunoni's accomplishments were set forth, and to which only the name of the town where he would next display them was wanting. He and his wife were so much absorbed in deciding where the red letters would come in with most effect, it might have been the rubric for that matter, that it was some time before I could get my question asked privately, and not before I had given several decisions, the which I questioned afterwards with equal wisdom of sincerity as soon as the signor threw in his doubts and reasons on the important subject. At last I got the address, spelt by sound, and very queer it looked. I dropped it in the post on my way home, and then for a minute I stood looking at the wooden pane with a gaping slit, which divided me from the letter but a moment ago in my hand. It was gone from me like life, never to be recalled. It would get tossed about on the sea, and stained with sea waves perhaps, and be carried among palm trees, and scented with all tropical fragrance. The little piece of paper, but an hour ago so familiar and commonplace, had set out on its race to the strange, wild countries beyond the Ganges. But I could not afford to lose much time on this speculation. I hastened home that Miss Matty might not miss me. Martha opened the door to me, her face swollen with crying. As soon as she saw me, she burst out afresh, and taking hold of my arm, she pulled me in and banged the door to, in order to ask me if indeed it was all true that Miss Matty had been saying. "I'll never leave her. No, I won't. I telled her so, and said I could not think how she could find in her heart to give me warning. I could not have had the face to do it if I'd been her. I might have been just as good for nothing as Mrs. Fitzadam's Rosie, who struck for wages after living 7 years and a half in one place. I said I was not one to go and serve Mammon at that rate, that I knew when I'd got a good missus, if she didn't know when she'd got a good servant. But Martha, said I, cutting in while she wiped her eyes. Don't but Martha me, she replied to my deprecatory tone. Listen to reason. I'll not listen to reason, she said, now in full possession of her voice, which had been rather choked with sobbing. Reason always means what someone else has got to say. Now I think what I've got to say is good enough reason, but reason or not, I'll say it and I'll stick to it. I've money in the savings bank, and I've a good stock of clothes, and I'm not going to leave Miss Matty. No, not if she gives me warning every hour in the day. She put her arms akimbo as much as to say she defied me, and, indeed, I could hardly tell how to begin to remonstrate with her. So much did I feel that Miss Matty, in her increasing infirmity, needed the attendance of this kind and faithful woman. Well, said I at last, I'm thankful you begin with well. If you'd have begun with but as you did afore, I'd not have listened to you. Now you may go on. I know you would be a great loss to Miss Matty, Martha. I telled her so, a loss she'd never cease to be sorry for, broke in Martha triumphantly. Still, she will have so little, so very little to live upon, that I don't see just now how she could find you food. She will even be pressed for her own. I tell you this, Martha, because I feel you are like a friend to dear Miss Matty, but you know she might not like to have it spoken about. Apparently, this was even a blacker view of the subject than Miss Matty had presented to her, for Martha just sat down on the first chair that came to hand and cried out loud. We had been standing in the kitchen. At last she put her apron down and, looking me earnestly in the face, asked, "Was that the reason Miss Matty wouldn't order a pudding today? She said she had no great fancy for sweet things, and you and she would just have a mutton chop. But I'll be up to her. Never you tell, but I'll make her a pudding, and a pudding she'll like too, and I'll pay for it myself, so mind you see she eats it. Many a one has been comforted in their sorrow by seeing a good dish come upon the table. I was rather glad that Martha's energy had taken the immediate and practical direction of pudding making, for it staved off a quarrelsome discussion as to whether she should or should not leave Miss Matty's service. She began to tie on a clean apron and otherwise prepare herself for going to the shop for the butter, eggs, and what else she might require. She would not use a scrap of the articles already in the house for her cookery, but went to an old teapot in which her private store of money was deposited and took out what she wanted. I found Miss Matty very quiet and not a little sad, but by and by she tried to smile for my sake. It was settled that I was to write to my father and ask him to come over and hold a consultation, and as soon as this letter was dispatched, we began to talk over future plans. Miss Matty's idea was to take a single room and retain as much of her furniture as would be necessary to fit up this, and sell the rest, and there to quietly exist upon what would remain after paying the rent. For my part, I was more ambitious and less contented. I thought of all the things by which a woman, past middle age, and with the education common to ladies 50 years ago, could earn or add to a living without materially losing caste. But at length I put even this last clause on one side, and wondered what in the world Miss Matty could do. Teaching was of course the first thing that suggested itself. If Miss Matty could teach children anything, it would throw her among the little elves in whom her soul delighted. I ran over her accomplishments. Once upon a time, I had heard her say she could play "Ah, vous dirais-je, maman" on the piano, but that was long, long ago. That faint shadow of musical acquirement had died out years before. She had also once been able to trace out patterns very nicely for muslin embroidery, by dint of placing a piece of silver paper over the design to be copied and holding both against the window pane while she marked the scallop and eyelet holes. But that was her nearest approach to the accomplishment of drawing, and I did not think it would go very far. Then again, as to the branches of a solid English education, fancy work and the use of the globes, such as the mistress of the ladies' seminary, to which all the tradespeople in Cranford sent their daughters, Miss Matty's eyes were failing her, and I doubted if she could discover the number of threads in a worsted work pattern, or rightly appreciate the different shades required for Queen Adelaide's face in the loyal woolwork now fashionable in Cranford. As for the use of the globes, I had never been able to find it out myself, so perhaps I was not a good judge of Miss Matty's capability of instructing in this branch of education. But it struck me that equators and tropics and such mystical circles were very imaginary lines indeed to her, and that she looked upon the signs of the zodiac as so many remnants of the black art. What she picked herself upon, as arts in which she excelled, was making candle-lighters, or spills as she preferred calling them, of colored paper, cut so as to resemble feathers, and knitting garters in a variety of dainty stitches. I had once said on receiving a present of an elaborate pair that I should feel quite tempted to drop one of them in the street in order to have it admired. But I found this little joke, and it was a very little one, was such a distress to her sense of propriety, and was taken with such anxious, earnest alarm lest the temptation might some day prove too strong for me, that I quite regretted having ventured upon it. A present of these delicately wrought garters, a bunch of gay spills, or a set of cards on which sewing silk was wound in a mystical manner, were the well-known tokens of Miss Matty's favor. But would anyone pay to have their children taught these arts? Or indeed would Miss Matty sell, for filthy lucre, the knack and the skill with which she made trifles of value to those who loved her? I had to come down to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and in reading the chapter every morning, she always coughed before coming to long words. I doubted her power of getting through a genealogical chapter with any number of coughs. Writing she did well and delicately, but spelling, she seemed to think that the more out of the way this was, and the more trouble it cost her, the greater the compliment she paid to her correspondent, and words that she would spell quite correctly in her letters to me became perfect enigmas when she wrote to my father. No, there was nothing she could teach to the rising generation of Cranford, unless they had been quick learners and ready imitators of her patience, her humility, her sweetness, her quiet contentment with all that she could not do. I pondered and pondered until dinner was announced by Martha, with a face all blubbered and swollen with crying. Miss Matty had a few little peculiarities which Martha was apt to regard as whims below her attention, and appeared to consider as childish fancies of an old lady of 58 should try and cure herself. But today, everything was attended to with the most careful regard. The bread was cut to the imaginary pattern of excellence that existed in Miss Matty's mind. The curtain was drawn so as to exclude the dead brick wall of a neighbor's stable, and yet left so as to show every tender leaf of the poplar which was bursting into spring beauty. Martha's tone to Miss Matty was just such as that good, rough-spoken servant usually kept sacred for little children, and which I had never heard her use to any grown-up person. I had forgotten to tell Miss Matty about the pudding, and I was afraid she might not do justice to it, for she had evidently very little appetite this day. So I seized the opportunity of letting her into the secret when Martha took away the meat. Miss Matty's eyes filled with tears, and she could not speak either to express surprise or delight when Martha returned bearing it aloft, made in the most wonderful representation of a lion. But after she had passed, she turned round and ran after me to ask, oh, so kindly, about my poor mother, who lay on her deathbed. And when I cried, she took hold of my hand to comfort me, and the gentleman waiting for her all the time, and her poor heart very full of something, I am sure. And I thought it such an honor to be spoken to in that pretty way by the rector's daughter who visited at Arley Hall. I have loved her ever since, though perhaps I'd no right to do it. But if you can think of any way in which I might be allowed to give a little more without anyone knowing it, I should be so much obliged to you, my dear. And my brother would be delighted to doctor her for nothing, medicines, leeches, and all. I know that he and her ladyship, my dear, I little thought in the days I was telling you of that I should ever come to be sister-in-law to a ladyship. We all would. I told her I was quite sure of it, and promised all sorts of things in my anxiety to get home to Miss Matty, who might well be wondering what had become of me, absent from her 2 hours without being able to account for it. She had taken very little note of time, however, as she had been occupied in numberless little arrangements preparatory to the great step of giving up her house. It was evidently a relief to her to be doing something in the way of retrenchment, for, as she said, whenever she paused to think, the recollection of the poor fellow with his bad 5-pound note came over her, and she felt quite dishonest. Only if it made her so uncomfortable, what must it not be doing to the directors of the bank, who must know so much of the misery consequent upon this failure? She almost made me angry by dividing her sympathy between these directors, whom she imagined overwhelmed by self-reproach for the mismanagement of other people's affairs, and those who were suffering like her. Indeed, of the two, she seemed to think poverty a lighter burden than self-reproach, but I privately doubted if the directors would agree with her. Old hoards were taken out and examined as to their money value, which luckily was small, or else I don't know how Miss Matty would have prevailed upon herself to part with such things as her mother's wedding ring, the strange uncouth brooch with which her father had disfigured his shirt frill, etc. However, we arranged things a little in order and were all ready for my father when he came the next morning. I am not going to weary you with the details of all the business we went through, and one reason for not telling about them is that I did not understand what we were doing at the time and cannot recollect it now. Miss Matty and I sat assenting to accounts and schemes and reports and documents of which I do not believe we either of us understood a word, for my father was clear-headed and decisive and a capital man of business, and if we made the slightest inquiry or expressed the slightest want of comprehension, he had a sharp way of saying, "Eh? Eh? It's as clear as daylight. What's your objection?" And as we had not comprehended anything of what he had proposed, we found it rather difficult to shape our objections. In fact, we never were sure if we had any. So presently Miss Matty got into a nervously acquiescent state and said yes and certainly at every pause, whether required or not. But when I once joined in as chorus to a decidedly pronounced by Miss Matty in a tremblingly dubious tone, my father fired round at me and asked me what there was to decide.
and I am sure to this day I have never known. But in justice to him, I must say he had come over from Drumble to help Miss Matty when he could ill spare the time, and when his own affairs were in a very anxious state. While Miss Matty was out of the room giving orders for luncheon, and sadly perplexed between her desire of honoring my father by a delicate, dainty meal, and her conviction that she had no right, now that all her money was gone, to indulge this desire, I told her of the meeting of the Cranford ladies at Miss Pole's the day before. He kept brushing his hand before his eyes as I spoke, and when I went back to Martha's offer the evening before of receiving Miss Matty as a lodger, he fairly walked away from me to the window and began drumming with his fingers upon it. Then he turned abruptly round and said, "See, Mary, how a good, innocent life makes friends all around. Confound it! I could make a good lesson out of it if I were a parson, but as it is, I can't get a tail to my sentences. Only I'm sure you feel what I want to say. You and I will have a walk after lunch and talk a bit more about these plans." The lunch, a hot, savory mutton chop, and a little of the cold loin sliced and fried, was now brought in. Every morsel of this last dish was finished, to Martha's great gratification. Then my father bluntly told Miss Matty he wanted to talk to me alone, and that he would stroll out and see some of the old places, and then I could tell her what plan we thought desirable. Just before we went out, she called me back and said, "Remember, dear, I'm the only one left. I mean, there's no one to be hurt by what I do. I'm willing to do anything that's right and honest, and I don't think, if Deborah knows where she is, she'll care so very much if I'm not genteel, because you see, she'll know all, dear. Only let me see what I can do, and pay the poor people as far as I'm able." I gave her a hearty kiss and ran after my father. The result of our conversation was this. If all parties were agreeable, Martha and Jem were to be married with as little delay as possible, and they were to live on in Miss Matty's present abode, the sum which the Cranford ladies had agreed to contribute annually being sufficient to meet the greater part of the rent, and leaving Martha free to appropriate what Miss Matty should pay for her lodgings to any little extra comforts required. About the sale, my father was dubious at first. He said the old rectory furniture, however carefully used and reverently treated, would fetch very little, and that little would be but as a drop in the sea of the debts of the town and county bank. But when I represented how Miss Matty's tender conscience would be soothed by feeling that she had done what she could, he gave way, especially after I had told him the £5 med adventure, and he had scolded me well for allowing it. I then alluded to my idea that she might add to her small income by selling tea, and to my surprise, for I had nearly given up the plan, my father grasped at it with all the energy of a tradesman. I think he reckoned his chickens before they were hatched, for he immediately ran up the profits of the sales that she could effect in Cranford to more than £20 a year. The small dining parlor was to be converted into a shop without any of its degrading characteristics. A table was to be the counter, one window was to be retained, and the other changed into a glass door. I evidently rose in his estimation for making this bright suggestion. I only hoped we should not both fall in Miss Matty's. But she was patient and content with all our arrangements. She knew, she said, that we should do the best we could for her, and she only hoped, only stipulated, that she should pay every farthing that she could be said to owe for her father's sake, who had been so respected in Cranford. My father and I had agreed to say as little as possible about the bank, indeed never to mention it again if it could be helped. Some of the plans were evidently a little perplexing to her, but she had seen me sufficiently snubbed in the morning for want of comprehension to venture on too many inquiries now, and all passed over well with a hope on her part that no one would be hurried into marriage on her account. When we came to the proposal that she should sell tea, I could see it was rather a shock to her, not on account of any personal loss of gentility involved, but only because she distrusted her own powers of action in a new line of life, and would timidly have preferred a little more privation to any exertion for which she feared she was unfitted. However, when she saw my father was bent upon it, she sighed and said she would try, and if she did not do well, of course she might give it up. One good thing about it was she did not think men ever bought tea, and it was of men particularly she was afraid. They had such sharp, loud ways with them, and did up accounts and counted their change so quickly. Now, if she might only sell comfits to children, she was sure she could please them.